Prior to the start, I would like to mention some general rules for participation. As I noted in the first message I sent you, all participants are automatically muted, just because we want to avoid any background noises or participants talking over each other. So anyone that wants to join the conversation can raise a hand or write a question using the chat tool. We tried it before. Please use the chat tool for posing questions. Also, you can use the raise a hand feature. The raise a hand feature is a feature available on the right side of your screen, just below the participant segment. The chat tool has an option for both public and private conversations. So please use the public feature when you have a message that concerns all participants. And now we have a chat message. Thank you, Jana, for your introduction. I'm glad you can hear us well. You can pose a question anytime during the webinar session, but bear in mind that there will be a designated Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So today, this is a more introductory lecture for persons that have not participated in webinars, but are interested in developing webinars on their own. So we're going to speak about what are webinars, which are the advantages of webinars in online learning. We are going to mention some common webinar features and tools, as well as some tips for successful promotion of your webinar, especially if you're looking for new audiences. How to conduct a successful and engaging webinar session, as well as several useful tips that every webinar organizer needs to know. Webinars are part of online and distance education, which are becoming more and more important due to their inherent focus on the learner rather than the educator. And in the times we're living, there is a persistent need for continuous upgrade of the knowledge and the skills of the workforce. So we have more and more adults that decide to return to the process of learning, engage in non-formal education, or look for more flexible learning environments. Online education and distance education provide that flexibility to adult learners, which have different constraints related to limited time and limited resources to invest in education and training. So learning online defined as using the internet for accessing learning materials, interacting with the content, the other participants, and the lecturer, and receiving support in the learning process, has developed with various tools and methods and in every form, both formal, non-formal, and informal. When speaking of online tools that support learning, we can speak of synchronous and asynchronous computer-mediated or CMC tools. Asynchronous tools are tools that provide the possibility to engage in interaction which is timely, delayed in time. So we have email, recorded presentation, or sharing of learning materials, all of which can be conducted in a time-delayed manner, while synchronous CMC tools relate and provide immediate interaction between the participants in the learning process. So we have live audio communication, live video communication, and live chatting. On the one hand, online learning and distance learning provide learners with enormous flexibility to learn and to advance in learning at their own pace and at a time when it's convenient for them. But the lack of immediate feedback on behalf of an educator can gradually create for many students a sense of isolation and lead to reduction in motivation. This is one of the main reasons for the massive acceptance and openness to various synchronous tools in recent years. Synchronous CMC tools actually play the role of a bridge between the traditional classroom and e-learning, enabling both learners and educators to interact live. Webinars represent one of the latest technological innovations in this regard and enable online learning from multiple electronic devices. So in order to participate at this webinar session, you could do it through a personal computer, but also through any type of smart device, such as tablet or smartphone. All you need is an internet access and audio connection so you can listen to the lecture. The popularity of online and distance learning is also evident in the recent popularity of MOOCs, or the massive open online courses, which provide the possibility for receiving quality education at great distances, the possibility to freely disseminate educational materials and interact with educators and other learners. Speaking of webinars, what are webinars? Webinars, the term itself is a contraction of the terms web and seminar, and it was developed in the late 1990s, initially designed as a meeting service. As such, it was relatively quickly adopted by the business community, which used it in various ways, mainly to cut costs regarding organization of meetings, even internal training of employees. However, it still represents a relative novelty in the sphere of online learning. The concept of webinar itself is quite general because it stretches and encompasses features and tools which are changing and modifying on a daily basis. And one definition just cannot refer to the numerous possibilities for the use of this technology, which educational providers utilize and adapt in various ways to suit their needs. However, there are certain characteristics and common uses that apply to the term webinar. The first, it is that it's conducted in an online environment and it requires the use of specific software. It is a live event scheduled at a precise time, and participation is by invitation only. Webinars have a limited duration, lasting 1 maximum 2 hours for presentation of different types of content. Webinars provide the possibility for immediate interaction with participants through audio, through chat, through quizzes, surveys, whiteboard. We will see some of the features later. It provides participants with partial anonymity. You can participate in many webinars without the need to turn on your camera, show your face, or even reveal your name. You can use some kind of nickname or some username that makes no reference to your actual identity and participate in some kind of learning session. Webinars include and usually provide giving authorizations, so the person running the webinar may give different authorizations to the participants, for example, to make them presenters. This is very useful if you have a class or hold a webinar course, so the participants had some kind of engagement, offline engagement outside the webinar session. They can present what they have worked on in front of all of other participants. The on-demand feature is related to the possibility to record and edit and disseminate the recorded webinar. This is excellent feature because it turns the webinar session from a synchronous CMC tool into asynchronous, providing a time-delayed communication, actually providing all participants in their learning process to review again and again the video of the recorded lecture as many times as they need. Webinars represent an excellent addition to blended learning programs, so interaction started in a traditional classroom can be continued through an online working session through a webinar platform, using all features that webinars provide to support online learning. What are the particular advantages of webinars to be a great tool for online learning? The first main advantage is related to reducing logistical and other expenses. It reduces time commitment to travel and to participate at a certain venue to attend a certain learning session. It reduces and eliminates actually costs for travel and accommodation. It is an easy and free way for dissemination of training materials in an electronic form. It is thus very convenient for adult learners which often struggle to find time and resources to invest in education. Webinars are actually very time efficient, providing the possibility to concentrate educational content in a much shorter time span. They provide lasting value through the possibility to record the webinar and disseminate the webinar recording through different channels. Webinars, particularly webinar software, is fairly easy to use. I assume that some of the participants of today's webinar are attending a webinar session for the first time. I did not see that anyone had any problems to adapt to specific functionalities of the platform. Those features are all features that you have used in other types of software. Webinars are excellent because they represent both synchronous and asynchronous learning tools, synchronous during the live webinar session and asynchronous with the possibility to record and review the webinar recording. It is complementary to other forms of education, especially to blended learning programs, and it's very inclusive of people with disabilities or marginalized groups that would otherwise find it difficult to attend traditional educational sessions. Now we're going to move on to some popular webinar formats. We have different typologies of webinars. We're going to mention two today. This one is related to the number of speakers and the number of and the type of engagement provided to the audience at the webinar session. The most common webinar format is the one-speaker format. This is today's webinar format, where we have a single presenter to speak and demonstrate and answer questions from the audience. The advantages of this type of format, we have only one person to coordinate and train on the webinar tool, that is a single lecturer. But on the other hand, a lone presenter is much more likely to become the authority in the room, which might make some participants in the audience reluctant to engage in discussion and pose questions. The second type of webinar is the interview style webinar, where we have an interviewer and a lecturer, and the interviewer asks a set of predetermined questions. It is much more engaging to hear multiple voices, and the fact that the presentation is evolving through questions may motivate also the audience to participate with questions at the Q&A session. The disadvantage of this type of format is that we have more people to train and coordinate. I have to remind you that in most cases, the interviewer, the two lecturers, are not in the same room. They cannot read the body language of the other participant, and it can happen that both the interviewer and the lecturer speak over each other. You can hear background noises from two different settings. So it can be more distracting for the audience to follow if we do not have a well-trained interviewer and the lecturer. The moderated panel discussion represents a third type of webinar format where we have multiple people on the line at the same time, and we have a moderator which facilitates the discussion. This type of webinar is great because it offers a variety of voices and perspectives, but the main disadvantage remains that we have more people to train and coordinate to communicate in an online environment, and can be very challenging to keep panelists from talking over each other. The fourth type of webinar format is actually related to the participation of the audience and engagement of the audience in the webinar session. This is the interactive webinar where audience members participate fully via instructor-led exercises, facilitated discussions. If done well, the participants receive deeper understanding of the subject matter because they're fully engaged in the dialogue and the exercises. However, this type of webinar can accommodate only a small group of participants, 5 to 6 maximum. Furthermore, this type of webinar requires very skilled, very experienced lecturer, facilitator, and moderator. Now we are going to move on to certain webinar features that show why webinars are convenient for online learning. I have to mention that there are numerous webinar platforms out there that provide a wide variety of features which change and receive upgrades on a daily basis. However, we have tried to make a selection of the most common one that are present in almost all webinar platforms. So you can see their functionality, you can see their advantage to use in educational purposes. The dashboard is the first feature I'm going to speak about. The dashboard is an excellent tool for the lecturer and the moderator of the webinar session because it provides different analytical information regarding the ongoing webinar session. The information are related to the duration of the session, the number of attendees, the audience attentiveness, any possible questions or active polls or raised hands. An important functionality provided by some webinar platforms is the attentiveness meter. The attentiveness meter is an interesting tool because it displays the percentage of session participants who are using the webinar application on top of all other applications on their screens, in comparison to those participants which are active, which have activated the application, but are using it in the background. Polls are excellent feature for receiving information from the audience in a fast and effective way. They're great for receiving immediate feedback regarding the prior knowledge or experiences of the attendees. It's also a great way to keep the audience attention and provoke engagement. I have to mention that polls provide participants in the webinar session with anonymity because the results display general tendencies and total responses and not breach the attendees' anonymity by providing which participant answered in what way. So we're going to try one poll. You're going to see a window on your screens. Please provide us with an answer. A large majority of the participants have not participated in a webinar before, and I'm sharing the results with you now. And we're going to continue with the presentation. Screen sharing is what we're doing at the moment. I'm sharing my presentation with all of you. Screen sharing is a feature that enables the moderator to share his or her screen and all the ongoing operations on the screen, as well as all the active applications during the webinar session. It is also great because it does not share the whole desktop of the lecture, but the lecturer can select certain applications that he or she wants to be shared, thus not breaching the privacy of the lecturer by revealing other open applications. The desktop remote control is a feature that grants control over the presenter's desktop to another user. It is suitable for webinars with multiple presenters or for webinars where the lecturer wants to engage the participants by allowing them to contribute to the lecture with presentations. Website co-browsing is a specialized feature that allows two users on different computers to control a shared browser instance. The temporary presenter capability is a feature that transfers the moderator authorization to other participants in the webinar session. The chat tool, we have tried it earlier, is plainly speaking a real-time text messaging tool. What is excellent about this tool is that some webinar platforms provide the so-called breakout rooms. The breakout rooms actually give the possibility for the lecturer to divide the whole group into several subgroups. These subgroups can work on tasks or exercises on their own in separate rooms and then present the results back in the webinar session in front of all participants. The whiteboard tool is very common in traditional classroom learning and can be an excellent tool for developing new functions in a similar way. I think that we have a participant that raised a hand. I would like to ask you just to be patient so we can finish the presentation, and remember your question. You can pose it later during the Q&A session. If there's anything urgent, you can write me a message using the chat tool. We can try the whiteboard tool now. As you can see, both the lecturer and the participants can draw and write text, create different types of shapes. You can try it too. And then we can clear everything that we've done. And continue with our presentation. Webinar recording is another feature that is excellent because it's both useful for the lecturer and the participants in the webinar session. The recorded webinar can be reviewed by the lecturer and see if there are any shortcomings in the presentation or space for improvement. While for the participants, they can review certain aspects of the presentation. If their concentration dropped during any time of the webinar session, they can review what they've missed on the recorded version. Video sharing is another functionality that's supported by webinar platforms, and it's recommended for more experienced users due to the fact that sharing video materials can be very prone to technical problems. Question and answer sessions, or Q&A sessions, are not a specific feature of webinars, but they have become a standard practice throughout the years. It is useful to have at least one, maybe several Q&A sessions. They're usually placed at the end of the lecture, so participants can pose questions and engage in discussions. So now we're going to the main dilemma. What type of webinar do we want to organize? A one-off event or a webinar course? Webinars are very flexible and can be adapted to all type of educators' needs. So there are numerous variants of webinars. The most common are webinars as one-off events, but depending on the needs of the learners and the aims of the educator, you can also organize webinar courses. Webinars as one-off events are much more common. They're much more suitable for larger audiences, suitable for more experienced participants. And participants who are poorly familiar with the topic of the webinar can face problems in following the presentation. There is not much space to engage in interaction between the educator and the participants. However, they're suitable for adult learners because they're one-off events. They do not require specific commitment on behalf of the participants to engage and be present at other webinar sessions. Their adult learners are usually well acquainted with the topics of the webinar, and due to the fact that the webinar software is fairly easy to use, they do not require some specific preparation to participate at the webinar. Webinars as one-off events are not very convenient for more ambitious educational goals because learning depends on participants themselves. There is not much possibility to make evaluations in terms of the participants' commitment and the achieved results during the learning process. Due to this, they often have a semi-educational goal, a presentation of a new product or an advanced version of an existing product. They also are suitable for larger audiences when you do not expect to engage in more deeper interaction with the lecturer. Webinar courses represent series of webinars structured in the form of classes held on a regular basis 2 to 3 times a week over a period of several months. They're not suitable for large audiences, and the objectives and results of the learning process are more precisely defined. They have much more flexible structure. They're more adaptable to the specific needs of the participants. They rely on both synchronous and asynchronous interaction and learning. So We engage in communication and interaction during the webinar session, but participants also have other engagements like homework, writing essays, or some type of offline work, which is later subject to assessment. These type of webinars require much more larger commitment on behalf of the participants, and of course require complementing with asynchronous forms of learning, such as any other types of offline work. However, webinar courses provide greater quantity and quality of interaction if the lecturer um, perceives that there's a problem with some segment of the learning material. They can prolong and reschedule the webinar session so they can devote more time to aspects that are deemed problematic. However, this also means that webinar courses are usually held with smaller groups, up to 10 participants maximum. What kind of webinar strategies we can have? These webinar strategies are related to the engagement of the participants themselves in the learning process. So we have three types of webinar strategies: the didactic webinar, the engagement webinar, and the immersion webinar. The didactic webinar is much more similar to traditional face-to-face lectures. It's a much more teacher-centered approach. Therefore, it's much more suitable for webinars which are one-off events and which have a large number of participants. They usually contain just one-way flow of information. The advantage of this is that participants are generally familiar with the approach. However, there are some disadvantages, such as the low degree of interaction with the learners, which may lead to possible low retention on behalf of the participants. The engagement webinar presupposes more active participation on behalf of the attendees. There are more opportunities for interaction between the lecturer and participants through discussions, polling, using the whiteboard tool. This is more suitable for smaller webinars when all participants can have the opportunity to engage in meaningful interaction. Engagement webinars actually represent excellent strategy for educators that want to maintain control over the learning process and encourage continuous collaboration with the attendees. However, for unexperienced webinar organizers, practice with smaller groups is highly recommended. The immersion webinar is a type of webinar that completely involves the learner. The lecturer here is more of a mentor, providing guidance than a mere presenter of information. And this type of webinar strongly relies on features that allow learners to take control over the webinar session. This is an approach that is much more focused on the active participation of the learner, active involvement of the learner, hence is very time intensive and suitable for smaller groups. However, it is excellent for learning some hands-on skills, such as practicing the use of certain software. How to conduct a successful webinar? Well, the art of science of delivering a quality webinar changes over time. Organizing an effective and successful webinar is never a one-man show. It requires work of a team, usually organizer, the presenter, and assistants. The moderator is the person that organizes all aspects regarding to the delivering of the webinar, the promotion, registration, communication with participants prior and after the webinar session. The lecturer or lecturers are usually limited to delivering a successful and engaging presentation. Activities like registration and troubleshooting are usually left to the moderator and the assistants. Despite the fact that many experienced webinar organizers can conduct a webinar session on their own, especially for large webinars, the use of assistants is highly recommended. Assistants can actually help by addressing technical logistical problems, answering questions from the audience. What is an important aspect in the delivering of a successful webinar is the promotion. Promotion is very important when you want to attract new audience. This means that you do not have established group of learners from your traditional classes that will just continue learning through the webinar feature, but you want to expand your audience to other learners and engage new people in your classes. Developing an effective promotion strategy is one of the priorities. Attendance with webinars is also a large problem. The statistics vary, but the data on convergence reveal that less than a half of all registered participants actually attend the webinar. How to prepare for the webinar? First of all, you have to select a popular and interesting topic, which should be general enough to attract larger audience, but also specialized enough to provide them with new and engaging information that participants can effectively apply. The second important step is to make a choice on a webinar platform. Uh, it can be Animeeting, Zoom, Adobe Connect, GoToWebinar. There are numerous dozens and dozens of webinar platforms, all of which provide different features you can use. I have to mention using every webinar platform is based on a subscription, so you have to pay to use the webinar software. However, there are different packages which range from a few dollars a month to several $100s a month, depending on your needs, whether you're going to organize a webinar for 1,000 people or you're just going to hold classes for 5 to 6 people. The promotion of the webinar should commence several weeks beforehand, so sending invitations for your upcoming webinar should start no later than a month before the webinar. You can use social media for promotion, you can use emailing for promotion, but you can also use some specialized webinar promotion websites such as Brainy Octopus. Brainy Octopus is a website which disseminates information regarding upcoming webinars. You can register for free, post information regarding your upcoming webinar, and people can register through this website. Or if you're interested in attending a webinar, you can visit the website and browse the categories and see if there's anything interesting that you would like to participate at. What you have to bear in mind during the scheduling of the webinar is to avoid scheduling webinars during weekends when most participants are reluctant to sacrifice friends and family time to participate at the webinar. Avoid also the beginning and the end of the work week when possible, which can be packed with last-minute emergencies and delayed obligations. Of course, in the process of preparation, creating an informative introductory web page is mandatory. This introductory web page should contain information such as the topic of the webinar, with the date and the time of the event, the profiles and short biographies of the lecturers, the main goals of the webinar, and all information about registration and possible attendance fees. Registration forms should not be long, not to demotivate or scare away potential participants. However, it is useful to get as much information from your registered participants so that you can adapt your presentation according to their needs. Registration of the participants should always be followed by a confirmation email, which helps establishing a contact with the participant and maintain this contact until the end of the webinar session. There is a certain time frame for development and conducting all activities prior to the organization of the webinar. What is very important here is sending reminder emails, actually maintaining the communication with the registered participants after their registration. So it's very important to send them a reminder email at least a day prior to the webinar session and another one at least several hours prior to the webinar session, in order to remind them that probably a month ago they have registered for an event that they would like to participate. Reminding them would not be intrusive, it would just be and a service you provide them to enable them to attend a lecture they were interested in. Uploading several previous webinars or samples of older work to be previewed for free, like on a social media page or YouTube, can be very useful in attracting new audiences. So you can pre-record a lecture or record your first webinar and disseminate it freely so you can attract new audiences. You can use paid media, blogging, and social networks in promotion, all of which have proved highly effective in attracting new audiences. How to conduct the webinar session. The start of the webinar session should contain some general information about the topic and to introduce the learners more easily into the subject matter. However, concerning the length of the webinar session, its duration has shown a trend of shrinking. So from an hour of lecturing to 45 minutes of lecture and 15 minutes for Q&A to 30-minute lectures and 20 to 25 minutes of discussion. If you consider that you have much more educational material you want to present before your audience, for these purposes, you can split the lectures into series of several separate webinar sessions, which are all held in one day to avoid the content overload and attention scarcity among the audience. The visual aspect in conducting a webinar is very important. This does not mean that you have to be prolific in graphic design, but bear in mind that for the most part of the webinar session, the only thing your audience sees is your presentation. So a recommended practice is to create multiple slides and move through them more quickly than in face-to-face lectures. It is very recommended to keep the audience engaged through initiating Q&A sessions and breaking the different segments apart into different Q&A sessions, using polls or annotations, just creating short brainstorming sessions between the participants so that you can keep their attention on the webinar session. The use of quality hardware is a must. You have to use, it's recommended to use a printout of the presentation slides even more prior to the webinar session. Be sure to have a prepared video lecture of the presentation you were about to give. In case of any technical problems, you can disseminate this video material to your registered participants. It is a good advice to break the segments of the lecture with short questions posed every 6 to 10 minutes. Post-webinar surveys are a highly recommended tool for evaluation of the webinar and the work of the lecture. Follow-up emails represent a standard practice. The follow-up emails contain the recorded webinar, supplemental lecture materials that should be sent to all registered participants, regardless of whether they attended the event. Many webinar organizers use guest speakers, so they want to make webinars more engaging by adding another speaker, another lecturer. The majority of experienced webinar organizers conduct regular practices of their lectures prior to the organization of a webinar. Promotion is a very important aspect, especially when you want to expand to new audiences and attract new people to attend your lectures. Obtaining registrants' profiles information is very useful in the sense that you can see the profile of your audience and prepare to address issues that they might find interesting. Sending invitations at least several weeks in advance so people can plan their time and find time to participate in your webinar session. It is not recommended to breach the 1 hour mark, the time you have set, and also providing time for Q&A. Many participants rely strongly on the Q&A functionality, and it's a very useful tool to engage, actually provide participants engagement in the webinar session. Polling is a useful method for keeping the audience's attention focused on the webinar session, while post-event surveying is regular practice conducted by most experienced webinar organizers. So I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm going to start with the question and answer session, Q&A session.